My name is Wendy, and in this video I'm going to show you how to crochet one of my Slouchy twist beanie hats. The pattern for this is a free download on my website, so I'm going to put the link in the description box below for you. But you can equally just make this hat from following this YouTube tutorial, because I'm going to take you through right from the beginning through to the very end. So the one that we're making today is this one here, and this is made, I think this was with Hayfield Breeze double knitting, and this one was made with James C. Brett Marble DK, but I will put the exact yarns that I used in the notes below for you as well. So it works very well with any multicoloured yarn, or equally just with a plain yarn. So taking a look at what you're going to need, for an average size lady's head, which I'd say is probably about 21.5 to 22 inches circumference around the crown, you're going to need 100 grams of double knitting. Now this is a really versatile pattern, so I'd say it works with most yarns out there. It works really great with self-striping yarns, but it equally looks just as nice with plain yarns, because you still get the diagonal stripe going across the crown. So 100 grams of double knitting yarn, I'd say if you're looking at the length of the meterage, probably around 280 meters is what you're looking at. A 4mm crochet hook. You'll also want to have a couple of stitch markers for this project, because that will really help you keep account of the amount of stitches in your rows. So I would suggest that you use either the padlock style stitch marker, or the deep in style, or the lobster claw, which I've got a picture to the side now to show you so that you can see what I mean. But if you haven't got any stitch markers, you could always improvise, perhaps by using something like a hair grip, or a paper clip, or even just a strand of yarn in a different colour to just hook through the first stitches of the row. So that's all we need. So I'm going to bring the overhead camera in and we'll get going. This is the right-handed video, so if you're left-handed, I'm going to put a link in here above now and in the description box below to take you to the left-handed video. To make the hat, I've started by making 74 chain on my crochet hook with a 4mm hook. Now your chain needs to measure approximately 15 inches, which is the total depth of the hat. So if for any reason your foundation chain is too tight, then I would go up a hook size and make sure that you get the right length chain before you start. But then do remember to come back down to your 4mm hook again. The first row we're working is our foundation row, and we're only working this row once. And we're going to miss the first chain underneath the hook, and then we're going to work into the top side of each chain all the way along the row. And we're quite simply working a row of UK half double trebles, and if you're using American terminology, this is known as a half double crochet. So I'm going to make a few for you just as a refresher. So I'm going to take the yarn over the hook, miss that first chain underneath the hook, and then I'm going to pop my yarn from front to back through one side of the stitch, yarn over the hook and pull back through to 3, and then yarn over the hook and pull back through to 1. Now once I've made that first stitch, I'm going to put a stitch marker in this, because this will help on the second row when I'm coming back to tell where the last stitch of the row will be. So I'm going to pop that in there. So that's through both sides of the V like that. So I'm now going to make my next half treble. So it's yarn over the hook, from front to back through one side of the next V, yarn over the hook, pull back through to the front, and I have 3 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook and pull back through to 1. So just once more, yarn over the hook, through the top side of the V, yarn over the hook, pull back through to the front, yarn over the hook and pull back through to 1. Now I'm going to continue making half trebles all the way to the end. So just hit the pause button and work this row, and I'll see you at the other side. So that's our first row complete, and we now make one turning chain so that we're ready to start our next row. So to work row 1 of the pattern, we're going to miss the first chain that's under the hook. That's the turning chain that we just made, and we're going to be working into the first 2 stitches, which is here, and that's the second one. And for this, we're working through both sides of the stitch, so we'll be looking at both sides of the V. So I'm going to be working a half treble decrease. So to do this, I'm going to take my yarn over the hook, and I'm going to put it through both sides of the stitch, yarn over the hook, and pull back through to the front. And I've got 3 stitches on my hook. At this stage, I stop, and I'm going to start another half treble. So I'm going to put the yarn over the hook, through both sides of the next stitch, yarn over the hook again, and pull my hook back through to the front. And I've got 5 stitches on my hook. And now I'm going to put my yarn over the hook, and I'm going to pull back through all of the stitches. Now, sometimes this can feel a little bit tight. So what I tend to do is make sure that my hook is facing downwards and I'm scooping back, but also I pull my stitches away from the hook a little bit, just to open up the gap under the hook and make it a bit easier to pull through. So it's just a nice scooping motion. And that's your half treble decrease made. Now at this point I stop and I put a stitch marker in this stitch that I've just made, because it makes it a lot easier when you come back on your next row to see where to make your final stitch. Okay, so I've got my stitch marker just nicely in place there. Now I'm going to work all the way along the row, making half double trebles in the back loop only, but I'm going to stop before I make my last stitch. So to make the half double treble in the back loop only, it's yarn over the hook, and where we have these V's, we're going to go through the back half of the stitch. Okay, so I'm going to do that again now. So it's yarn over the hook, hook through the back side of the V, the back half of the stitch, yarn over the hook, and pull back through to the front, and I have 3 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook, and pull back through to 1. So I'm going to do that again. Remember, you're working into the back side of that stitch. So it's yarn over the hook, hook through the back half of that stitch, yarn over the hook again, and pull back through, and I have 3 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook, and pull back through to 1. So again, it's time to hit your pause button, and I'm going to continue all the way along till I have 1 stitch left, and so I'll see you again at the end of the row. So now I've worked my row of half trebles in the back loop until I've reached the last stitch, and I know where that is because that's where I placed the stitch marker in the first stitch of the row below. So in this last stitch I'm going to make 2 half trebles, but I'm going to work again through both sides of the stitch like I did at the beginning of the row. So I'm quite simply going to make 1 half treble through both sides, so you can see both sides of the V, and then I'm going to make another half treble in that same stitch. So I've made 2 half trebles in the last stitch of the row. Now I can take my stitch marker out, and I'm going to make 1 turning chain, and now I'm ready to work row 2 of the pattern. So this is very similar to row 1, except we're going to make 2 half trebles in the first stitch, and we're going to make our half treble decrease in the last stitch of the row. So I'm going to miss the turning chain that I've just made, and I'm going to work 2 half trebles in the first stitch, working through both sides of the V. Okay, so I'm going to make 1 half treble through both sides of the V, and I'm going to put my stitch marker in straight away again, so that I can tell on the next row where my very last stitch will be. It just makes life a lot easier with this. And then I'm going to make my second half treble in the same stitch. Okay, so this is row 2, and we've made 2 half trebles in the first stitch. Now I'm going to continue all the way along, making half trebles just like I did in row 1 in the back half of the stitch only. So again, just to refresh you, that's yarn over the hook, and I'm just now working into that back half of the stitch. So yarn over the hook, hook through back half of the stitch, yarn over the hook, pull back through to 3, yarn over the hook, pull back through to 1. And again in the back half of the stitch, yarn over the hook, through the back half of the stitch, yarn over the hook, pull back to the front, and I have 3 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook and pull back to 1. Now again, I'm going to continue all the way along till I get to the last 2 stitches at the end of the row. So again, it's time to hit your pause button, and I'm going to see you again at the end. So I've now reached the last 2 stitches in my row, and I know this is the last stitch because it has the stitch marker in. So I'm going to work a half treble decrease across these 2 stitches. So I'm working through both sides of the stitch now, so I'm going to go through both sides of the V. So it's yarn over the hook, hook through both sides of the stitch, yarn over the hook and pull back through to the front, and I have 3 stitches on my hook. At this point I stop, and it's yarn over the hook, and I'm going to put the hook through both sides of the stitch where the stitch marker is. So that's there here. And then it's yarn over the hook and draw back through to the front, and I have 5 stitches on my hook. And then again it's one final yarn over the hook, but I'm going to turn my hook downwards, and I'm just going to pull slightly, pulling the stitches slightly away from the hook, opening up that space, and I can scoop back through, and that's my half treble decrease complete. So now I make my turning chain, and I'm ready to start my next row. So now I'm going to continue working these 2 rows until my work has reached approximately 20 inches, and that's 50 centimeters. So what I'm going to do is put the timings for the start of row 1 and row 2 in the description notes below, so that you can easily just go back to those points to have a refresher on how to make the rows. And it's also wise to check your stitches, to count your stitches along the row regularly, to make sure that you haven't lost any stitches and that your work isn't becoming narrower along the way. Because what you're achieving is you're going to achieve this offset rectangle, this parallelogram. So you're going to be having increases on one side and decreases on the other, and then this edge here is going to be the width of your head. That's going to be the circumference of your head here. So it's time to hit the pause button, and I'll see you when you've completed your work. Okay, so I've now reached 20 inches, which is approximately 50 centimetres, and I've made the last stitch of my row. I don't need to make my turning chain now. I can just get my scissors and cut my yarn and fasten off. And the main body of my hat is now complete. At this point, you want to take a look at your work and decide which you're going to use as the outside for your hat, as the pattern has two different effects on either side. One side has a more subtle effect, ridging, and the other one is more defined. I'm going to be using this side as my outside because I like the way that it highlights the lime green flashes. And then also you want to take a look at your side edges and see if you prefer one side edge to the other. If you've made any minor mistakes on one side, you can hide that in the crown. So I'm going to keep this edge as my lower edge of the hat, which will be the brim. So when it's turned up, it will be like that. And I'm going to use this edge here to be my gathered edge for the crown. But there is quite a lot of bulk in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one row of double crochet going all the way along, just to help pull it in a little bit more neatly before we gather up the crown. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. To do this, I'm going to rejoin my yarn into the top corner of the side where I'm going to be gathering up my work to create the crown. And then I'm going to make one chain just to secure it and hold it into place. So we're going to be working this row of UK double crochet stitches, which is single crochet if you're using American terminology. And we're going to be working a stitch all the way along for every other row. And this is quite easy to see because these ridges represent 2 rows. So it's quite easy to see what we're doing, and this should start pulling our work in, which will give us a neater edge, which we can then finally gather up to create the crown. So I'm going to take my hook and I'm going to go from front to back, and I'm going to go between the first and second stitch from the edge, and it's yarn over the hook, bring the hook back through to the front, yarn over the hook and pull back to 1. And then I'm going to do that again. I'm going to move on 2 rows and take my hook from front to back, yarn over the hook, pull it back to 2, yarn over the hook and pull it back to 1. And again, I'm going to go into my second row down. So it's hook from front to back, yarn over the hook, pull back to 2, yarn over the hook and pull back to 1. Now I would normally be doing this using the darker shade, which would be less noticeable, but in this instance I actually want you to be able to see what I'm doing, to see how it works. So I'm just working along every other row, picking up a stitch between the first and second stitch from the edge, making these double crochet stitches. And it's absolutely fine that it's gathering it up a little bit. This is what we want it to do. Okay. So if you have a look now, you can see that this is giving me a partial gather already, and it will make it a lot easier for me to gather that edge up rather than the bulkiness that I have here at the moment. So I'm going to continue this all the way along, so press the pause now and I'll see you when you get to the end of the row. So I've now reached the end of the row, and you can see that this has already partially gathered up the crown for me, which will make it a lot neater when we're doing that final gather. So I've cut my yarn, but I've allowed enough here that I can use for gathering up afterwards. So all I need to do is just pull my yarn through and flick it off to fasten off. all that's left now to do is to sew up the back seam of the hat and then to finally gather in that crown. So you will notice that it seems like a funny angle when you fold your hat over. So you've got one seam that's coming down diagonally that way and the other alternatively. Now you can sew your hat up whichever is your preferred method. I like to mattress stitch, so I have the right side of the work facing me when I'm sewing my things together. And I'm just going to pop a couple of pins in just to give me a little bit of guidance here so that I don't go too askew. And in case you want to see mattress stitch, I'll just start this off. But if you don't want to see mattress stitch and you're going to just sew your hat up, I will put the start point for gathering the crown in the description box below so that you can just fast forward straight to that. So for mattress stitch, for me, when I'm sewing up, I have the right sides looking at me. I'm going to take that pin out now and I just secure in my yarn at the bottom edge. Okay, and then I have my work looking at me and I'm going from front to back like a little running stitch on one side of my work. And I'm taking it across and doing a little running stitch into the other side of the work. Then I'm bringing my yarn across horizontally and another little running stitch. Taking my yarn back again horizontally. Make another running stitch. Take my yarn across again horizontally and make a vertical running stitch going up. Taking my yarn back horizontally again and making my little running stitch. And this is how I like to sew my things together. So it's time to hit that pause button now for the last and final time and sew your hat up in whichever is your preferred manner, whether that's using a mattress stitch like I am, or a back stitch, or an over sewing stitch. And then I will meet you back here for the last and final time to gather up the crown of our beanie hat, which will then be finished. I've now sewn up the back seam of my hat, which is running at this diagonal angle here, and you can see if I open my work up, this is my back seam in here. So now all that's left to do is to gather up this crown. So I've threaded a needle with the thread that I left after I finished off making my row of double crochet, and basically I'm just going to run the thread through the tops of those double crochet stitches that I made. I'm doing this running stitch, so I'm going through both sides of the chain, in and out, all the way around. And I should be able to start pulling that tighter. And I'm just going underneath both sides of the V's the last few to do. I'm going to put my hand up inside now to get the last few stitches, pulling it tighter as I go. And I'm back at that back seam. So once I've got back to the back seam where I started, I'm going to give it a good tug and then just secure that thread in place. So I'm going to do an oversew stitch and thread my needle through to tighten it, and then I'm going to take my yarn around again as and where I can, threading it through to make it a little bit more secure. Okay, and I can give that a tug when I get to the back. Pull it really nice and tight and secure that end. And then I'm going to take the yarn through to the inside of my work because I've still got a small hole left there. So I'm going to take the needle through and I'm going to turn the hat inside out. And this is something that I just like to do. And so with the inside of my stitches, I just like to catch a few on one side and come back to the other side and make an oversew stitch. And then just work my way around a little bit, making a few oversewing stitches to form a cross. And that just helps secure up any tiny little hole that you've got. So I think I'll make one more. So I'm just going through the back half of the stitch. This isn't showing on the front of my work at all, but it's just tightening up that little hole slightly more. So there we go. So now I can just do a couple of oversewing stitches and catch my yarn in to secure it off. And I'm going to do it again, hold it nice and firm. And then I'm just going to run my yarn through the backs of a couple of stitches, just to lose the end. And fasten off. And your hat is now finished. So you can wear it as it is, as a really slouchy beanie, or you can turn the brim back and you'll have the stitches on the brim travelling diagonally in the opposite direction. So I hope you've enjoyed making your hat and now want to make more. So if you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see more of my tutorials. So for now, I'll just say to you, happy crocheting, see you soon, and bye.